I'm Lori Dalbert, and I am the head of our HR consulting practice. I've been with Eide for 20 years, hit my anniversary about a month ago, and have been in this HR consulting role for about 6 years now, and definitely love talking with individuals about HR and ways that they can improve their HR practices. So thank you very much for joining us today, and I'm going to talk with you about how to survive a personnel records audit. All right, so I guess one of the top things we need to understand is why on earth would you want to prepare for an audit? And the reason that you want to prepare for a personnel file audit and make sure that your personnel files are in order is because it actually is an area of business that is regulated by the Equal Employment Opportunity Commission. And what they are doing is they're making sure that employers are retaining the right information on employees, that employers are granting access to information to proper individuals, and that employees actually have appropriate content that is being retained on them during their employment and then upon termination of their employment. When we talk about employment records that you might see in a personnel or an HR file audit, what we're talking about is any and all documentation and information that is related to employment activities. And that can include everything from the recruitment of an individual for your open positions, the hiring of individuals into your organization, the compensation that you are paying your employees, benefits that you might offer, and what benefits employees have enrolled in and might be paying premiums for. It includes performance-based information. It also includes medical type of information for leaves of absence, reasonable accommodation, or more recently to COVID-related type leaves. It could include information related to termination and the process that you went through when terminating an individual or when an individual is separating from being employed with you. What is the process that you go through and the documentation that you retain for that? It also includes work authorization, otherwise known as the Form I-9, and pretty much anything else related to the employee while they were with you or prior to getting hired into your organization, anything that you retain about that employee. So that is what we're talking about when we're discussing employment records and what you should be retaining and who you should give access to. When I am talking to HR during our session today, the person I'm referring to or the individuals I'm referring to are the folks within your organization who actually handle HR or at least maintain employee records. So you may be a smaller organization where you don't have a designated HR person. I'm talking, when I say HR, as we go through the presentation, I'm referring to the person who handles that HR function for you. I like to start things off with a polling question just so that we have an understanding of what the audience is made up of. So our first polling question is, do you keep your employee documents in one personnel file, either in a paper copy or in an electronic version? Do you retain one personnel file for your employees? Okay, great. Thank you for participating in that poll because it really does help me to understand maybe some of the practices that you all have in place when it comes to your personnel files. So it looks like a majority of individuals maintain one file for their employee records per employee. And we're gonna discuss this a little bit further and kind of explain the reasons why you should be separating out some of that information into separate files. All right, moving on. We have another polling question. With your personnel files, do you allow supervisors or managers to access all of the information for the employees that report directly to them? Do you allow them to take a look at the personnel file or the different personnel files if you maintain separate files for individuals? Do you let their direct supervisor or manager have access to that information? All right, great. Well, I am pleased to see that a majority of folks do not grant supervisors or managers with access to all of an employee's information. For those of you who are allowing supervisors and managers to see that info, hopefully during our conversation today, you will learn some of the types of documents that they absolutely should have access to, but then there are also documents that they shouldn't. So we will go through all of that during our presentation today. So thanks for participating in the polls. All right, we are going to get into it now. Okay, there are best practices when it comes to filing your employees' data. And collectively, we call this their personnel file. However, I'd like for you to start using some different terminology by calling it their HR records. And that way, it helps to differentiate between the types of files that supervisors should have access to and the types of files that they should not. So with regards to employee file best practices, there should be separate files for each employee. Each employee should have a personnel file. They should have a benefit/medical file. They should have a payroll or a confidential file. And then there should be some separate HR files to retain other pieces of information that are not related to a specific individual. So that would be recruitment files. So a separate file for each position that you recruit for that contains data on the candidates for that particular position. There should be a separate file for Form I-9s of your current employees. And there should be a separate file for Form I-9s of your terminated employees that you will retain for a period that we will discuss here soon. So this might be very, very different for many of you. If you are currently retaining employee data in one file and calling it their personnel file, you are going to need to make an effort to separate some of the information. And we're going to be talking about what information goes into each one of those files. The other thing we're going to talk about is best practices with regards to who should access this employee information. And with regards to employee data, supervisors should have access to what we call the personnel file, which will contain information related to the employee, their position, and maybe acknowledgements of handbook, of different policies that you might have, but it's really just employment-related information. Human resources will have access to all of the different types of documentation that is retained on an employee. So that will be the personnel file, the benefit medical file, the payroll or confidential file. They will have access to recruitment files and to both types of I-9s for your current employees and for your former employees. Employees should be able to access all of the records that you're retaining on them within the human resources area. So they would have access to their HR file, their personnel file, their benefit medical file, and their payroll confidential file. And then law enforcement or government agencies who might audit you, they will also have access to any and all documentation that you retain on an employee. I always feel that it's important to also discuss the fact that personnel files, HR files, they can come in a variety of different formats. You can retain information in hard copy files. That is perfectly acceptable. As a matter of fact, I just completed an audit on a decent sized bank where they still maintain paper copies of their personnel records. So they have a hard copy personnel file, hard copy benefit files, hard copy recruitment files. They have their I-9s in a binder for their current employees. Their I-9s are in a binder for their terminated employees. And then they have a separate confidential and payroll file. It was by far the cleanest audit I've ever done. They are able to just retain things in that format. They keep the information separated, and there was very little information that was missing and very little information that was incorrectly filed. However, I realize that there are a lot of HRIS systems out there that companies are utilizing. And so those HRIS systems, if you are maintaining your employee-related data in an HRIS system, you just want to make sure that you are utilizing any security access protocols that they have in place to ensure that only individuals who have a right to know the information are able to access it. So for example, a supervisor should be able to access the employee's performance-related data or data regarding their position title or any types of acknowledgements. So if that is stored in an HRIS system, ensuring that the supervisor can access that is appropriate. If, however, your system has benefit-related information or medical information or confidential information regarding the employee not related to employment, then you will want to make sure that security access for the supervisor is not allowed, so that they can't access that confidential information. I also realize that no one system is right for everyone. So you might maintain some information in an HRIS tool. You might have some hard copies of things. Just make sure that you are setting up the proper security protocols to ensure that only people who have a right to see the information and to know the information can access it. If you are maintaining hard copy files, they do need to be in locked file cabinets, and you do need to separate your personnel files that supervisors can access need to be in a separate locked storage cabinet from their benefit or medical related information, and also from any Form I-9s, recruitment related information, or that payroll confidential information. All right, so now let's talk about what you keep in these different files. So the personnel file is the one that the employee, their supervisor, their manager, the upward chain of command, human resources, and any government or law enforcement agencies are able to access. All of those types of individuals are able to see what's in the personnel file. In the personnel file, you might find some of the information from when the individual was hired. So you might have an offer letter, there might be a resume, the individual may have submitted some transcripts or certifications as part of their application process. You can include those types of items in their personnel file. You also will include any performance documentation in the personnel file, and that can be performance evaluations, it could be kudos, it could be performance write-ups or documentation about a policy not being followed. Anything related to performance can go in the personnel file. As far as compensation information goes, you can include any pay change notifications, any changes to their exempt or non-exempt level status. You can put bonus notifications in their personnel file because it is job related. Job position information can also be included in the personnel file. A number of the clients that I have been auditing recently include signed job descriptions in the employee's personnel files. So when the new hire comes on board, or if an employee is being promoted to a new position or moving into a different role, they have a job description there and they have the employee sign and date it. That information can go into the personnel file. You can also include any promotion or demotion notifications, job notifications, or job change notifications can go in there. Any trainings or certifications related to the employee. They got their degree, they went back to school and got a degree or some sort of professional designation or certification. You can take copies of that information and put it in the personnel file because it's work related. And then, of course, any acknowledgements. And acknowledgements include things like staff agreements, confidentiality or non-disclosure agreements. If you're in a state where non-competes are legal, you'd have a non-compete in your personnel file. Employee handbook acknowledgements or any policy changes that you are having employees acknowledge. All of that would go into the personnel file. And again, these pieces of information are pieces of information that the supervisor and the upward chain of command can take a look at because it is all job related. And then, of course, HR, government agencies, and the employee can also access personnel file information. The next type of file is a benefit medical file. This is filed completely separate from the personnel file for a number of reasons. Number one, it's going to contain benefit or medical related information on an employee. That information should be kept completely confidential and should only be between the employee and human resources or the person who might be handling a leave of absence or any type of medical situation. Within your benefit medical file will also be your benefit enrollment forms. So if you offer medical, dental, vision, life, short-term disability, long-term disability, any of those types of benefits, any enrollment forms or waivers will be in this benefit medical file. You also can include any flex spending, HSA or HRA type enrollment forms, as well as any retirement enrollment documentation. When it comes to the medical information, what we are referring to would be any reasonable accommodation requests that might come in. Maybe somebody has sprained their ankle and they're on crutches, and so they cannot do a specific part of their job. They can't stand for extended periods of time. They would get a reasonable request accommodation from their medical provider stating what type of accommodation needs to be made, and they would turn that in. That information would go into this medical information section of the benefit medical file so that the human resources person can work with the supervisor to ensure that reasonable accommodation is met. Within this section, you'd also find any medical leave information. If somebody's going on a maternity leave or they're having a surgery and need to be out of work for a period of time, any medical leave documentation would go into this particular file. Any doctor's notes. If you require that an employee provide a doctor's note to return to work after they've called in sick for any period of time, those doctor's notes would go into this benefit medical file and should be given directly to human resources. Any COVID-related documentation, if you are requiring vaccinations or different types of testing for your employees, then that type of documentation would go into the medical information file. And basically any documentation that references the health of the employee or their family members. This is completely confidential information. While a lot of people think, well, but it has to do with their ability to do the job, the documentation and what the ailment or the medical situation might be is not relevant to the job. And that's why human resources takes care of gathering that information, figuring out what the proper course of action might be, and communicating that with the supervisor so that they can then deal with the employee either with a reasonable accommodation or to allow the supervisor to know that the employee is going to be out for a period of time due to a medical situation. They don't need to know what that medical situation actually is. A lot of times, too much information can lead to different types of decisions when it comes to the employee and their future employment, and that is considered a violation of the Americans with Disabilities Act. So this type of information needs to be kept separate from the personnel file that a supervisor or manager might have access to. Again, the benefit medical file, the employee can access that information, human resources can access that information, and any government or law enforcement agency who is performing an audit or requests the information can have access to it. The payroll or confidential file is a separate file as well, and that again needs to be filed separately from the personnel file and from the benefit medical file. Within the payroll confidential file, you'll find information such as the W-4 that the employee has filled out to determine what types of taxes need to be taken out, their direct deposit form so that we know where to send their paychecks, any legal documentation that the employee might submit in case they had a marriage, a divorce, a birth, or a death. There could be child custody type paperwork. There could be criminal history documentation that's in there. There could be wage garnishments. Any host of different legal documentation should go into this confidential file. I also find that if employees submit a verification of employment and they've signed the waiver so that your company can release information on them, I always file those into this payroll confidential file because it might contain information about a loan that they're trying to get. It could be child custody type information. It could be a whole host of different things. And when an employee has submitted an authorization for the company to release info to somebody who's verifying their employment, I like to retain that documentation in case there are questions down the road about what was released. So that type of information goes into this confidential file. Background check results, if you do background checks, you can put your background check results in this payroll confidential file. Same with drug tests. If you utilize drug testing as part of your employment practices, whether that is pre-employment, during employment, at the time of accidents, or for reasonable suspicion. If you have a drug testing policy and you are drug testing employees, then having that drug test authorization form and their drug test results in this confidential file, this is where they belong. And basically, it's any documentation that affects employment decisions that don't fit in the personnel file or the benefit medical file. The payroll confidential file is given out to employees, to human resources, and to any government or law enforcement agencies that might request the information or be conducting an audit. Again, if we look at this list of items, there is nothing on this list that has anything to do with an employee's ability to physically do their job. It's all just background information that might affect their employment. And so human resources will handle it and work with the appropriate individuals within the employee's department to ensure that things are taken care of. The fact that somebody is going through a marriage or a divorce may affect whether they are at work for different periods of time. It's the fact that they're getting married or divorced has nothing to do with their employment. It might have to do with missing work. And if it has to do with missing work, you're going to deal with the aspect of missing work, not with the fact that it's caused by a marriage or a divorce. All right, polling question number 3. Do you retain the documentation that you gathered during the recruitment and hiring process? Okay, perfect. It does look like a majority of you retain your recruitment related information, which is great. We want to make sure that we talk about what is appropriate to retain and how to retain that information. With recruitment information, it's important to understand that is considered pre-employment information. And so it should truly go in a separate file. And so as we look at recruitment related files, there are some best practices with how to retain that information. All right, so recruitment information. I spent a huge part of my career, probably 20 years, in the area of recruitment. And so I have a lot of experience with regards to this area and some best practices for how to retain the information, not only so that it's compliant with EEOC guidelines and to prove that you are utilizing non-discriminatory hiring practices, but also to utilize the information in the future to your benefit. There is a lot of time and effort that goes into recruitment and how you file the information that you're gathering. You may as well get a little bit more bang for your buck than just having a file of something that says, hey, we filled this position and here's the information. So with recruitment files, my recommendation for best practices is that they are separated by position type. So let's say you are hiring an administrative assistant, and you might hire 4 administrative assistants over the course of a year. You should have separate files for each time you are filling that position, because then you are able to prove, here was the position, here are the people who applied, here's the individuals we interviewed, here are the individuals we extended offers to, or the individual we extended an offer to, and then that wraps up that particular position nicely. You open another position, you're able to show the same thing. And that way, if you are ever audited, it's just simply pulling that recruitment file out for the position that they are telling you they want to take a look at, so that you can show them the process that you went through and the fact that you followed a consistent practice to hire someone. So with a separate file by position, what you are going to do is you're going to identify your applicant statuses. So the individuals who apply, each one of them should fall into a particular status. First, you're going to have the person that you hired. Then you might have somebody who you extended an offer to. They may have declined the offer, or you may have rescinded the offer. But an offer was extended and they ended up not being hired for the position. You have individuals that you interviewed who were not selected. You have individuals who you may have phone screened or pre-screened and they were not selected. You might have candidates who were not qualified for the position and so they didn't merit any further consideration. You might have other candidates who withdrew from consideration after applying. And you might have candidates who failed the background check or any testing that you might have in place. Within each of these folders, you should organize your candidates based on their status. So you should have your hired candidate, you should have any candidates who were extended the offer but weren't hired. Then you should group the interviewed but not selected. So you're going to group them by status. The information that you should retain on those individuals would include whatever information that you gather during your hiring process. So if you require a resume, then every candidate who applied for your position should have a resume. If you have an application, which I highly recommend, then the candidates who applied for the position and submitted their resume should have an application. Or maybe you determine that only people who are brought in for an interview are expected to complete the application. If that's the case, then any candidate who was hired, who was extended an offer, or who interviewed should also have an application as part of their record when looking at that recruitment file. You may require educational transcripts or certifications. If so, then you would retain that information. You may have taken notes during a pre-screen or a phone screen, and please understand that a phone screen or a pre-screen is considered an interview in the eyes of the EEOC. So if talking to someone further about their interest in your position or talking to them to get information from them about their skill set and their expertise or their education, regardless of how casual that conversation might be, and whether it's over the phone or in person, that is considered an interview. So you should be taking notes and you should have standard questions that you're asking during that pre-screen. That documentation should absolutely be part of the record for that candidate. If you conduct in-office interviews or interviews via video conference, you should have standard interview questions and should be asking those questions and taking notes. And then there should be some sort of interview feedback that you are able to complete to indicate whether you're pursuing the candidate further or you're not pursuing them and you have a select reason why. Background checks or testing results should also be part of the candidate's record within the recruitment file, as are any offer details that you might be gathering and any voluntary EEO information that you have gathered. EEO information actually should be separate. You should have all of the EEO information for each position separate from the actual candidate's recruitment file. Now, there are some of these pieces that you're going to gather during the recruitment process that may become part of the personnel file. My recommendation is to make a copy of the information for the recruitment file. So anybody you hire, you likely will want a copy of their resume, their application, and the offer, as well as background check results as part of their new hire documentation. And the resume, application, and offer would go in the personnel file. The background check or testing results would go into that confidential payroll file. EEO related information, so that voluntary EEO information should be accessible only by human resources. That should be maintained in a separate file. And you want to make sure that that information is not shared with other individuals within the employee's reporting structure. General information related to recruitment can be shared with the supervisor, the person who's hiring for the position. If you do references or things of that nature before you hire, then you can share reference information. I highly recommend that you do not share background check results or drug test results with a hiring manager. If somebody happens to fail the drug test or the background check, human resources should just notify the hiring manager that that individual did not pass the screening process to be hired, and no further details should be provided. That's considered confidential information. All right, so I do have a question with regards to audits. Have any of you been audited? Have you had your personnel files or your HR records audited? All right, so it does look like some of you have been through the joy of an audit. Hopefully you were able to learn some things about your processes through that audit. For those of you who have not, I think it's great that you're on this session so that you can get your HR related documentation in order in case you are audited. So if you have a feeling that maybe your HR related documents and your employee related documents aren't in best practice status, as we've talked about. There are ways that you can conduct an internal audit of your own to correct things and to employ some of these best practices. The first thing that I would recommend you do is that you create these separate files for your employees. Now, I'm not just talking about hard copy files. If you are a hard copy file person, awesome. It makes it a little bit easier to create some of these things. But you can also create on a secure drive a file for each employee where maybe the folder is called personnel files or HR files, employee files, and then each employee has a folder, and within each employee's folder, you have subfolders for these areas. Or you may have an HRIS system that allows you the opportunity to store your data. So with that, you're going to create a personnel file, a benefit medical file, and a payroll confidential file for every employee. Or in your HRIS system, you're going to make sure that there is a record where you can upload information for employees and provide the security access to ensure that the proper individuals have access to the information. You'll then want to create a Form I-9 file. I have found that binders work really, really well for organizations that have maybe 200 or fewer employees. You can alphabetize your I-9s by employee and have their information in there. We're going to get into I-9s here soon, but have a separate I-9 filing system, whether it's a binder, a hard copy file, or an electronic version. Each employee would have their own file for the I-9. You'll then create one for your terminated employees. And that I truly do recommend that you keep offline and have in some sort of a system that allows you the ability to delete or destroy those documents. Again, a binder system will work, or if you're using a secure drive for your terminated employees, you would have the employee, each employee would have a record, a file that would indicate when you can destroy their document. And we'll go through that here shortly. You'll create your recruitment files. I recommend going back 1 year. You are required to retain the recruitment information that you gather for a period of 1 year from the date that you fill the position. So create recruitment files for each of the positions that you filled within the last year at a minimum. And then what you're going to do is you're going to sit down and you're going to identify all of the standard documentation that you collect on an employee. So start with the recruitment process. If there is a position requisition or a job description or some sort of position approval process, you're going to list that. If you require a resume, an application, phone screen questions, interview questions, some sort of assessment that you gather, whether it's a personality assessment or a technical skill assessment, you're going to list that. You'll go through background check, drug test, references. What are all the standard documents that you're gathering during that recruitment process? List them out. Then you'll look at your onboarding process. What are the standard documents that you use for onboarding? Do you have a new hire checklist? Do you have a system access checklist? Do you have an offer letter, a staff agreement, an employment agreement, a non-disclosure, a confidentiality agreement? Do you have an employee handbook acknowledgement form? Do you have benefit enrollment forms and waivers? Do you have performance evaluations? Do you have a performance improvement document? Do you have employee change documents? So if somebody's wage is changing, if their job is changing, if their FLSA status is changing, is there some sort of employee change form? You're going to go through every single one of your types of documents that you might collect on an employee, and you're just going to list them out. What I usually do is I put it in a spreadsheet and have the document listed across the top and the employee names listed along the left-hand side. And then as I'm going through each employee's record, I am indicating whether or not that document is present in the employee's documentation or if it is missing, right? If you currently have all of your documentation filed in one file, you're going to pull stuff out and put it in the proper filing system to ensure the right access is granted based on the employee's documentation. At the end of that, you might see that you have 7 employees who are missing an employee handbook acknowledgement form. That's a pretty important document. It outlines all of your policies. If there is a policy violation, it is far easier to deal with the employee if they've signed an acknowledgement that states, hey, I received the handbook, I reviewed the policies, I know that I should have been doing that and I wasn't. That's what an acknowledgement is. That would be considered a critical document. And if it's missing, you would want to then follow up with and collect that missing document from the employee. Something like a direct deposit or a W-4 form, if your employee doesn't have it and they've been working for you for 7 months or more, they're getting a paycheck and it's being direct deposited properly. So chances are highly likely that that form was completed at some point in time. It's just missing from the file. It's not considered a critical document because if the employee hadn't filled it out, you wouldn't be able to withhold taxes or to direct deposit their check. They would have come and let you know that. So you identify what are some of these critical documents, and then you go back to the employee and you get those documents to ensure that you are covered from a risk perspective. And the non-essential type stuff, you just indicate that you just don't have that on file. And if you want to reach out to the employee and say, hey, we're missing a W-4, we're missing a direct deposit, it'd be great if you could complete those for us, then there's no problem with doing that. However, what you're really trying to do is to ensure that you have all those critical documents to mitigate risk on the backside if something goes wrong. All right, so what do you do in a circumstance where you go to the employee to let them know that their handbook acknowledgement is missing and you need for them to sign it, and they refuse to sign it? There's a couple of things that you can do in that circumstance. Depending upon the type of document it is, and for a handbook acknowledgement, I would say that you probably want that completed just to protect yourself in case there are performance issues or reasons for termination. You can meet with them, explain the need for the document to be completed, and if they still won't sign it, you can make a note of their refusal or ask them to note that they're refusing to sign the form. Or if it truly is something that is pretty critical, you can make it a condition of their continued employment. If you expect every employee to sign a confidentiality agreement saying that they're going to keep your company, secrets confidential during their employment and upon leaving employment, then that might be considered a critical document. And if they're not willing to sign that confidentiality agreement, you may decide it's time to part ways. So just make sure that you're identifying which of these documents are critical and which one should we have in place. And if an employee decides they're not going to sign it, what is going to be our next steps? So when it comes to maintaining files in a proper manner, there are a lot of great things that can happen from that. And it can affect your recruitment and your retention efforts just by ensuring that you have the proper documentation. Number one, what it's going to do as you're going through your employee files is it's really going to solidify whether you're following your own HR processes and practices or not. Whether you are saying, yes, we do this for every position, we post the job, people apply, we do a phone interview, we do the background check, we do the references, and then we hire them. If you're doing your personnel file audit and you're finding that 5 of the 10 people that you picked for the audit never had a background check, never had a drug test, that's a problem because that could lead to discriminatory hiring practice claims if somebody is not hired for a position. If they were drug tested and they had references done, but the person that you hired didn't get drug tested and didn't have references done, and there's some sort of disparity with a protected class, it can get you into some trouble. So it will show you what types of consistent practices you have in place. Now, with regards to strong compliant recruitment records, if you maintain organized records with regards to recruitment, and you are retaining that relevant, important information on each candidate, you can actually utilize that information for future hires. For example, let's say you had two great candidates. You decided to go with candidate A and you hired candidate A, but candidate B was a phenomenal candidate as well. Your second choice candidate is somebody that you can reach out to if a similar position opens up. Or you may decide, based on following that consistent practice, that you need to hire both of them, that it's too good a candidate for you to pass up. The other thing is that those candidates, if you're retaining really good records, if another position opens up, you can consider those candidates that you've had for other positions. If you've retained their information, you know their answers to some of your standard questions, maybe they're a great fit for this other opportunity, you can refer them to that other opportunity. If you're not maintaining great records, aren't retaining information like the interview notes or references or things of that nature, then you don't really have a basis with which to look at that candidate for future needs. And as I mentioned earlier, recruitment takes a lot of time and effort. This is a way to capitalize on a lot of that effort that you're putting forth, is considering candidates not just for the position that you have open, but if a different position either is currently open that you can mention to them and refer them to, or if another position opens up, you can then contact them and say, hey, we really enjoyed talking with you about that position last month. We've had a new opening. We'd love for you to consider that opportunity and encourage them to apply. The other thing is that strong recruitment process and documentation can turn all of the individuals who apply into a pool of candidates for you for future consideration. For example, individuals who may have applied for an entry-level position for you several years ago, now they might have the experience that you would need for an experience level position. I know that in our world here at Eide Bailly, recruiting accountants, we recruit straight out of college for our new college grads, but we also have positions available for somebody who might have 3 or 4 years of experience, so a senior associate level individual. Somebody who is a new college grad is not a good fit for somebody who we need to have 3 to 4 years of experience. However, by maintaining accurate recruitment-related records, 3 years from now, I can go back to recruitment records, and this is especially the case if you have an HRIS system or some sort of applicant tracking system. It's a little bit harder in hard copy, but you're able to go back to those individuals who may have applied for entry-level positions 3 years ago to see, hey, who were some of the people who, from a personality perspective, we really, really liked, and who, from a skill set perspective, they've got great communication skills. They did great in school. We didn't hire them for that entry-level position because we had other candidates, but they were a great candidate for that entry-level position then, and maybe somebody who is a great experienced individual. You have the name, you can go onto LinkedIn, look them up in LinkedIn, see what they're doing. And if they have been on the track that would be a good fit for your experience level position, it's somebody that you can reach out to. It's not a cold call then from the headhunter terms. It's more of a warm call. You already know the individual. They already expressed an interest in your company years ago. And now you are reaching out to them because they may have the expertise for some of your harder to fill experience positions. The other thing that maintaining compliant employment-related records can do is it allows you the opportunity to see patterns of behavior. If you have an employee who is performing really, really well, they're getting regular pay increases, they're getting exemplary or exceeds expectations ratings on performance evaluations. People seem to like them a lot, enjoy working with them. They've got great skills. You can see that in the performance-related documentation that you are collecting during performance evaluations. And that can help set you up to then promote them or to see if maybe there's certain traits that they're exhibiting that would put them on a great trajectory for a career path that you might have in mind for them or something that might interest them. It also works to your benefit if there are poor performance behaviors. You can see it documented so that if you are addressing a particular performance issue, you have that documentation you can go back to say, we've been talking with you about this for the last year. On this date, we documented this particular issue. On this date, we had to document it again. You seem to improve for a couple of months, which we really appreciated, but now we are seeing those behaviors again. And if you follow a progressive discipline format, by having that documentation in their file, properly filed, you can see it so you can address that performance issue in a more strict way. When you keep your medical and benefit information together in that one file for an employee, it allows you the opportunity to quickly and efficiently handle situations that arise that are related to medical or benefit type scenarios. And employees appreciate that. If you have all of their information together, you may have seen a history of some sort of disability so that you can work with them on a reasonable accommodation. You can work with them on leaves of absence that might be coming up and assisting them with figuring out what time will be paid, what time won't be paid based on employee benefits that you offer for paid time away, return to work dates, how to handle their benefits when they might be on an unpaid leave of absence, any benefit coverage changes that might come up. So if they have a marriage or a birth, you can go to their benefit medical file and you can see who do they have on their plan. If they're already on the family plan, adding someone else onto the plan may not increase their premiums, and you can share that information with them. And it also allows you the opportunity to keep those beneficiary details right in that one location. So it helps with efficiencies and also with handling situations properly if you've got their information in that one location. Keeping your payroll information together can help show salary history and progression. So if you're wondering what kind of pay increases somebody has received over the last 5 years, you might go back and notice that, oh, it's been 3%, 3%, 3%, 3%. And you think to yourself, this is one of my top performers. Why are they getting the same amount of a pay increase as someone else who isn't performing as well? And on the other side of that, you could see if somebody had a 5% pay increase, then an 8% pay increase, then a 7% pay increase. And you could say, hey, over the last several years, they've received some significant pay increases. We haven't seen a significant increase in their performance output. They're just barely getting by. Maybe we don't need to give them as large a pay increase. So seeing that salary progression in one specific spot can really help out. All right, we're going to talk about the Form I-9, and we just have a few minutes here, and so I'm going to whip through a lot of this a little more quickly. I will share this presentation with everyone who is on the call today or on the webinar today when I respond to all of the questions so that you have it and can go through this and utilize it as a tool. The last polling question is, do you have one person or one department that handles the completion of the Form I-9 for all of your new hires? Okay, great. Well, it looks like a majority of you do either have one person or one department. It is really, really important that as an organization, you have this Form I-9, which proves work authorization. It proves to the government that you're hiring individuals who are legally authorized to work in the United States. It is so important that you have one primary person or at least one primary department that has trained individuals on how to complete this, and that you don't just leave it up to whoever happens to be at the front desk that day, right? Like, you want to make sure that this is a serious, it really is a high risk area, the completion of this form. And I do a lot of Form I-9 audits, and I will tell you 99% of Form I-9s are not completed correctly. If you're an organization that is utilizing E-Verify as part of your Form I-9 completion process, then good for you. They make it almost impossible to complete it incorrectly. But the majority of individuals don't utilize E-Verify. So we're going to go through just a couple of things really quickly. Okay, so with the Form I-9, it is required that you have employees complete this either before they start or at least within 3 days of their start date. If they do not provide you with a completed Form I-9 and their work authorization documentation that proves that they are legally authorized to work in the U.S. within that time frame, you have to suspend their employment until they can provide the work authorization. So a lot of people don't know that. It's important to understand it's not just a piece of paper that we have to fill out like a direct deposit. This is a serious form that can cause thousands of dollars in fines if it is found that you are not having your employees complete their Form I-9s. Current employee I-9s, the employee is always going to complete page 1 of the Form I-9. You as the employer will review page 1 and complete page 2, and then you will retain page 1 and page 2 of the I-9 along with copies of their work authorization documentation. You're not required to retain those copies, but it sure makes it easier to prove that you verified work authorization if you have the copies of the work authorization. The only caveat to this is if you are utilizing an E-Verify system, then what you will do is you'll retain page 1 and page 2, and then you retain that e-file confirmation, the E-Verify confirmation, and a copy of that passport, a passport card, a permanent resident card, or Form I-766, which are List A items. For former employees, you're going to retain all the same information. The thing is, you have to retain it on any employee who has been terminated, and you retain it for either 1 year from termination date or 3 years from their date of hire, whichever is a longer period of time. So if somebody was just hired January 1, they've already left your organization, you're going to have to retain that Form I-9 until January 1 of 2026. It's 3 years from date of hire. If they were hired 5 years ago and they leave, it's 1 year from their date of termination. Now with the Form I-9, the current version is I believe it's October of 2019. They are looking at updating that document. We were told it would already be updated, but it has not yet been updated. So just make sure that you are using the current version of the Form I-9, and it'll list it on the actual document. When you hire an individual, you want to make sure that you let them know that they're going to have to complete a Form I-9. And then my recommendation is to send them the Form I-9 ahead of time and kind of direct their attention to page 3, which is a list of work authorization documents. You are not allowed to make recommendations for what the employee should bring. You are just supposed to refer them to page 3 and let them know they have to bring either one item from list A or an item from list B and an item from list C. Okay. When that employee fills that document out, you are going to review page 1. Page 1 needs to have every single box filled out. If they do not have a middle initial, if they do not have another last name or a maiden name, if they don't have an apartment number, they're going to put NA in that box in order for it to be complete. They'll want to make sure that they check a work authorization option, whether they are a permanent U.S. resident, they are legally authorized to work in the United States, they have a visa or some sort of permanent resident card that proves their work authorization. They have to check their status. And then they need to sign and date it. And that date needs to be within 3 days of their hire date. And if they have not filled out that form by that date, again, you need to suspend their employment. You should not continue employing individuals who are unable to prove to you that they are legally authorized to work. The last section that we see that is always left blank down at the bottom is a preparer and or translator box. And they either will check that no, they didn't use a preparer or translator, they filled out the form themselves, or they will check that yes, they did need a preparer or translator, and that individual will need to fill out the bottom of that form. You will verify that. You will make sure that they filled out every space. Then you will take a look at their work authorization documentation. You will complete page 2 of the Form I-9, and then you will make copies of their work authorization documentation and file it in your current employee Form I-9 file or binder or whatever your filing system is. No one other than the person handling the human resource function should be looking at that Form I-9. Someone's work authorization is something that your HR person or the person responsible for that function should be handling. Supervisors should not know what sort of work authorization this individual has provided, because it does lead to areas where it could lead to discriminatory hiring practices. And so you have to be really, really careful about who you have accessing that Form I-9. Again, employees are allowed to choose which of the documents that they're going to use to prove their work authorization. You want to make sure that you are not over verifying. So if they happen to bring a passport and a driver's license and a social security card, you will either choose the passport, which is a list A item, and tell them, thanks for showing me the other stuff, but I don't need it. And you will only document that list A item. Or you will pick the driver's license, which is a list B, and the social security card, which is a list C item, and you'll document those and say, thanks for bringing the passport, but I don't need that. Over documentation leads to huge fines. So just be very, very careful that you are only receiving and documenting the appropriate documentation for the Form I-9 record. And again, you cannot tell the employee what they should bring or make any recommendations. They need to make that decision on their own. If you already can tell that you have Form I-9 errors, you can make corrections to those errors very easily. Employees will make changes or corrections to page 1 errors. If they don't have a middle initial or an apartment number listed on theirs, you'll have them come in and put NA, or they will enter whatever their middle initial or apartment number is, and then they will initial and date when they made that correction. Employers do all of the corrections on page 2. And again, you just draw a line through anything that's incorrect, put the correct information, initial and date it. So if you did have too much documentation that you recorded, you're going to cross through like the list A item and initial and date it, as long as you have the list B and the list C items. You then will want to make sure that you attach some sort of memo to your corrected Form I-9s that indicate, hey, we did an internal audit, we've corrected our Form I-9s, and we've made it a process during orientation to have the forms completed within 72 hours. We have one person who is doing it. We've made as many of the changes as we possibly, or corrections as we possibly can. And that is a good faith effort to show that you are trying to do the right thing when it comes to work authorization. And oftentimes that will either lessen the fine that you might receive if you're audited by the government, or it could do away with the fines completely. I already went through all of that. So with regards to personnel records, conducting an audit of your employee records can really help you identify gaps or inconsistencies with your HR processes. You can correct any of those inconsistent practices to mitigate the risk that might come into play with regards to employment laws. And having those consistent practices will really provide you the opportunity to have your leaders focusing on the business operations that move the company forward, which makes your organization more attractive for potential hires and for your current employees.